Good evening. Welcome. And welcome to our virtual audience this evening. I'm Stephen Davey, the senior producer here at WBUR CitySpace. Thank you all for coming out, especially on such a beautiful night. And the Red Sox are playing, so I appreciate it. Bullying, abuse, and sexual harassment have not only been a part of restaurant culture, but they have been worn as badges of honor by celebrity chefs for decades. The MeToo movement has put a spotlight on these behaviors, forcing some prominent public apologies. Boston's restaurants seem to have sidestepped a reckoning. But recent backlash against Chef Michael Scelfo, comments made by Chef Ming Tsai, and now reporting from the New York Times and Boston Globe about renowned chef Barbara Lynch call into question just how widespread toxic environments remain in the industry. Tonight we're going to have a discussion about what's going on in the restaurant industry. But the topic of abuse in hospitality is much more widespread. We'll be broadening the context, and importantly, we want to talk about solutions. What can be done? What can we do as restaurant goers? On stage tonight is Hassel Aviles. She's the co-founder and executive director of Not 9 to 5. That's a global nonprofit focused on mental health advocacy in the restaurant and hospitality sector. Irene Lee is the co-founder of Mei Dumplings and Prep Shift and a James Beard Leadership Award winner. Janelle Nanos is a business enterprise reporter at the Boston Globe and just found this out, 2023 Pulitzer Prize finalist. And Hannah Selinger is a James Beard Award nominated writer and in 2008 the corporate beverage manager for the Momofuku Restaurant Group in 2008. And moderating tonight's conversation is Robin Young, co-host of WBUR and NPR's Here and Now. And we want to hear from you. What questions do you have? Head to slido.com and enter cuisine. That's sli.do and enter cuisine at the top. We'll get to as many questions as we can. Now, please welcome Hassel Aviles, Janelle Nanos, Hannah Selinger, Irene Lee, and Robin Young.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. Red Sox, beautiful weather. We appreciate your being here. And we know we have a big audience online, so thank you for being there. Some in the back of restaurants, we understand, so thank you. And I want to acknowledge first that this conversation that we're going to have may be uncomfortable for a lot of people. You know, there are people working in Boston's restaurants who feel they've been abused and they want to be heard. And in this most recent shock to our system, there's an icon from Boston, a woman, who so many wanted to see succeed in the restaurant business because hers was a story about overcoming a brutal childhood to create a restaurant empire. So there's plenty of feelings to go around, and we just want to acknowledge that we know that. But as my grandmother did, I will quote Robert Frost, who said, "The best way out is through." So we're going to go through right now. Here we go. Janelle, I want to start with you. Let me add my congratulations for your Pulitzer Prize finalist nomination. And you have a story in the Globe today about concerns about Barbara Lynch's restaurant empire and investors possibly pulling out. Previously, of course, your reporting uncovered the allegations of abuse that are now shaking the foundation of that empire. So can you remind us, what were some of the things that you heard in your reporting?
First off, thank you so much for having me here and for having this conversation, because I think it's one that we really need to keep having. And I think the restaurant industry has been through so much, particularly over the last 3 years. And we don't want to lose sight of the fact that there's a lot of people's lives that have been hurt in so many ways. So I think, you know, the Barbara Lynch story is, we talked about open secrets in the promotion of this, and I think there's a lot of people who've experienced a lot of hardship there. But I think, you know, the industry is just really hard in general, and so I'm just really appreciative that people are coming out tonight to have this conversation. So that said, specific to Lynch, there were allegations of inappropriate behavior. Let's just say this to start. You know, inappropriate touching. Under the influence, she would often arrive at the restaurants and either, you know, yell and scream at people, or she would escalate problems to the point where she would be touching people inappropriately. She grabbed someone from behind the bar, screamed at them in front of guests. You know, she was known for yelling at guests and making people feel uncomfortable.
As you know, ace reporter that you are, these are allegations.
Of course.
And, you know, she's denied them several times over.
Yes.
You note that she'd written in her 2017 book that she feared people were going to take the kingdom from her grasp, something she, you know, from South Boston back in the day, she climbed out to create. So she had big fears about that. And now she feels this is just those people she feared, taking down a woman who's defied the odds over 25 years. So how do you know, Janelle, how do you know that the story that you had was right?
I think when you're reporting a story of this nature, you have to be extraordinarily careful, right? And you want to make sure that allegations of this nature are serious and that they're true, right? What I needed to do in instances where I was talking about abuse is cross-check that with people who were there or who got the phone call the day later. In the case of the first story I wrote, there was a tape. And so you could hear the screaming match that happened, and you could clearly hear her voice. And so, you know, that sort of evidence does validate some of these claims. And again, to talk to people who have experienced things over and over again that can, you know, sort of verify the allegations, and at least there's trends there that you can report that show that there's a pattern of abuse over time. And
just, we're going to move on and get everybody involved here, but we also know that Barbara Lynch was known for helping employees build, you know, sustainable lives. She offered benefits, education, even mental health counseling. She did talk about her own alcoholism and trying to handle that. What happened? Do we know what happened?
I don't. I haven't had the chance to talk to her, and I would love the chance to talk to her, honestly. I think that would be, you know, something I would willingly do. I think my best guess is that the combination of stress of running a high-profile restaurant group and the pandemic and, you know, substance abuse combined can be a really difficult thing. And I don't mean to diminish any of those things. I just think I think that there's a lot there that we don't know, and I don't want to get inside anyone's head.
Yeah.
You know, I know that she's been through a lot.
Well, I do want to ask of the people on the panel, how many of you, and I don't want to put people on the spot, but I know people who are foodies now in Boston, and they say, well, we heard all these stories. Had you heard these stories? Has anybody heard these stories?
Yes. Also, yes.
Yeah. Well,
can I add one thing? Also, they're systemic.
Right.
So it's really beyond one person
Right.
or one place.
Well, in
this
fact,
is a systemic problem.
Yeah. So let's listen to this clip because it goes right to that point. I have a couple questions. You know, why didn't we hear about this sooner? And how broad do we think this is? So let's listen. This is restaurateur and celebrity chef Tiffany Faison, who was here at WBUR CitySpace at the end of January with Tiziana Deering. And she suggests, as you have, that this is, everybody knew and it's widespread. Let's listen.
So interesting in all of the cultural reckoning and the MeToo movement, we have not had one chef go down in Boston. Because we're perfect?
Should we have a chef go down in Boston?
Absolutely.
Do you want to say anything
Multiple,
more about that?
absolutely not. Yeah, it's not that we don't have those issues culturally. We had a journalist call around to everyone, and everyone had stories about kitchens we've worked in, things that we know about other chefs, and largely called the women. And we put ourselves on the line to have conversations about the things that we knew. No story was ever written. And when I had a conversation with the journalist and said, whatever happened to this? She said, well, if everyone's to be believed, every man in this city is an abuser. So what am I going to do? Well, I don't think every man in the city is an abuser, but also, isn't that your job to suss it out?
So I'll ask you again, is there any more that you'd like to say about that here?
Yeah, I mean, look, I will say this. There are still people operating that would shock you, that are, I think people's behavior has changed a little bit, and I don't think it's altruistic. I think it's because they're so deeply afraid of going down. But yeah, there are chefs that you know and love that have created, built supported and live in cultures of abuse in the city.
Irene, I want to go micro first, then macro. You said you'd heard of this. I mean, how well known is this? Because it seems like she's stepping right to the edge of. She said men, and here we have a woman. And I don't want to focus just on Barbara Lynch, but it does seem as if a lot of people knew about this alleged behavior. So, just your thoughts. Were you watching from afar? She said people don't want to talk, because they don't want to go down. That's, you are a restaurant, someone in the industry, more than an owner, with May. Yeah.
I think, I know we all laughed when Tiffany said, no, I don't want to name anyone. And I laughed too, and it's not funny.
No.
It's not funny because she is one of the most powerful female chefs in our industry, and she feels that there is not space or safety for her to tell the stories that she is aware of. And so I think, speaking to my role as the owner of a restaurant, I am from outside of the industry. The first restaurant I ever worked in, I was there for 6 months, and then I opened my own, so that's how ignorant I am. But I would hear things, and I didn't come up in the culture where people know who's good and who's bad. But as I learned over time, it feels gross. It feels gross that so many of us have heard things, and we are, whether we want to or not, effectively protecting bad actors because we don't know what to say, who to say it to, how to get the right story to the right person, who to have go on record. There's a lot of complexity to journalism that I am only just learning about, which all of you know very well. And so I guess my reaction is like, all of us know a lot. Yeah. And the question is, how do we go from open secret within the industry to having a more constructive conversation that's not just about accountability, but also moving forward?
Okay, I want to go to Hassel because you're dying to jump here, I can tell, and then Hannah. As you said, it's not just that people know these things. Entire food shows have been designed around people behaving poorly.
Correct.
There's a lot of bad behavior in industries, but what is it about the food industry? Is it that someone's standing there with a knife? Is it that they're drinking? And I'm serious. What is it that's igniting this particular behavior?
I want to highlight something Irene just said, that there's complexities to journalism. There's even more complexities to trauma. And what we're talking about is workplace trauma. It's physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse. It's harassment, it's bullying. And I think, what is it about the industry? I mean, there's so much shame, and silence breeds shame. And with trauma, you tend to have a lot of silence and shame unless you get a lot of help and you're able to, express those experiences in a way that you feel is safe to you. There's little to no physical and psychological safety in a lot of toxic work environments. And our restaurant industry has a lot of toxic work environments.
Well, it also has incredible pressure to get the food out on time, to make the fire just right. There's a lot of additional elements that go with cooking that can add. Anyone who cooks your own dinner, how stressful.
Can I say one
be.
more thing too? I think also, all of us are industry adjacent here for the most part, and that's a privilege. So, it's taken me decades to get to the point where I can feel comfortable talking about these restaurant experiences. And there's so many systems of oppression at play in the industry that are they're by design meant to keep us silent.
Well, I'm thinking, for instance, if you don't have your citizenship and you're in the back of a house, you're not going to
Yeah, and so there's high risk to career development, there's high risk to job security, there's high risk to industry reputation. So you're right, like there's people's livelihoods on the line. It makes a lot of sense that there's not a lot of people speaking, especially industry frontline service workers. If you're an owner operator, you have a little bit more power and privilege. If you're industry adjacent, you have even more power and privilege. If you're, you have platforms and followers and all these things, you have more power and privilege. But it's a very real thing to be scared into silence when you have these experiences.
I want to bring Hannah in because Hannah, at Momofuku, you work with David Chang, whose kind of rage was well known and almost celebrated. And then I thought it's so interesting. You were fired. And he wrote a memoir that you've written about. And just give me 1 second here. Hassel, you talked about trauma, and I'm looking out here to see if my producing partner, Karen, is here somewhere. There you are. I'm sure you had the same reaction. You mentioned trauma, Hassel. We had a story on Here and Now Today with a woman named Dr. Judy Herman, and I recommend anyone go listen to it. In the 1970s, she was one of the Radcliffe feminists who started to see that, women especially, but men too, who had suffered from violence, abuse in the home, were having some of the same symptoms as returning Vietnam War vets. And both were fighting for recognition. It was not recognized that it was a thing. And one of the things that she writes about, she wrote some of the books on trauma, the early books on trauma, that forced the diagnostic manuals to include in the definition of trauma something that could happen in the home. The definition of trauma was that it could only happen in an unusual experience like war. That was the definition.
And the definition of trauma is ever evolving.
Right.
So we're still learning about trauma every single day, every single week, every single month, and the complexities that it doesn't have to actually be around one event.
And it can be from just feeling someone's rage. And Hannah, you not only felt that rage, and I want to know, what does that feel like to be somebody working with that heat that's coming off someone? And then, go ahead. And then, when they write a memoir, and they are said to be apologizing for it, this is another thing that Judy said, Dr. Herman said. Sometimes an apology, if you don't trust it, it forces you as the person who suffered through the rage to give a pardon that you don't feel. So talk about your experience.
Yeah, I mean, the entire experience of having to sort of read Dave's book and to parse through his language line by line made me have to sort of go back and live an experience that was at that point 12 years old and yet still very fresh.
Why? What happened? What did he do?
He was a larger than life figure, and at that point in my time and in my life, I was vulnerable. You mentioned undocumented people who work in kitchens, but those are not the only people in kitchens who are vulnerable. Anybody working in a kitchen is vulnerable. Any server working in a kitchen who can be fired in an at-will state like Massachusetts or an at-will state like New York can lose their job.
You're all nodding. I just want to point out. Yeah.
You can lose your job and you can be out on the street with no paycheck the next day. You don't have to have you don't have to be without papers. You can lose your job security just like that. And in my 20s, that job security was lost for me. There was always the threat of that. So, these people who have that kind of power, they hold it over you.
Well, there's that fear, Hannah, but also rage is a frightening thing. I mean, I understand he would break tables, he would scream, he would throw things. That's scary.
Yeah, it's physically threatening. As a woman, it's physically threatening. There's something just sort of indescribable about it. And I think, when you have to sort of go back and plumb that, I'm working on a larger piece right now, a book about this for Little Brown, and going back through emails and going back through restaurant experiences is more psychologically damaging than I thought it would be. It's hard to put yourself back in that place. But, you asked before about, why there's sort of a lack. It's not just that why won't people come forward, or why are we discussing Barbara Lynch and did people know, or why did she do this? It's that the people who would come forward, they see a lack of there's a lack of accountability when people do come forward. I came forward, I wrote 6,000 words about David Chang and 6,000 words about his rage and how it impacted me. And everyone said it was a beautiful piece, and I was nominated for a James Beard Award. And he continues to have collaborations with East Fork Pottery, and he continues to have a thriving business, and he was nominated for a James Beard Award on the same day that I was nominated for a James Beard Award. So I guess I wonder, just like everybody else on this panel wonders, when people will actually be taken seriously when they come forward with these kinds of allegations.
Well, I have a question for you from the audience, though. This was what year when he wrote his memoir in 2020?
Yes.
And you felt, well, tell me how you felt about what seemed to be his acknowledging his behavior.
I felt like it was disingenuous.
Okay. And so that gets us to, what people like Dr. Judy Herman have said, which is that puts you in the uncomfortable position of you can't laud that as everyone else was. So I guess that might be the answer to this audience member's question, but somebody's asking, how long does a chef have to be nailed to the cross for things that happened years ago? How do you know that changes, maybe changes have been made? How can you tell? And I'm asking Hannah, but maybe get to Hassel too, because I know this is part of your work. What does somebody have to do to make it right?
I mean, I postulated in my piece that he should step down and give the business to somebody else, and I still maintain that. And I maintain that for all abusers. Mario Batali will be opening a new restaurant soon, and, does anybody here think that that's okay?
Yeah. Hassel, how do you handle this? Again, not 9 to 5, an advocacy group. What's your position?
I don't think we have enough time, to be honest, to really go into the real answer to that question. There's so much nuance, and there's so much complexity, and there would be so much information that we would need to cover to properly answer that question. But I think it requires centering the voices of those most affected. I think that oftentimes we are way too caught up in politics or awards or, all these other factors that play in. And I think we have to acknowledge, there's many people that are complicit in the upholding of those that have the most power. Like, to your point, whether it's owner operators or whether it's like food media helps with this. They award and applause and restaurant awards, Michelin, and all these different establishments that literally applause these people beyond, just what we're talking about here. Keep featuring them. We keep supporting them. We keep giving them shows, keep giving them investment for more restaurants, more products, more brand, deals and this kind of thing. But I think what's required is more listening. And there's not enough listening. There's not enough believing. I mean, again, not to try to make this controversial, but even the fact that you're still like, did it really happen? And asking, did that really happen? Like, we're still not believing survivors. We're still not believing people that are coming forward with their stories. I mean, I have a hard time with that because it's really, really uncomfortable as someone who has survived these experiences to hear the word allegations. There's nothing to win from coming forward and saying, I've been abused, I've been yelled at, I've had a pot thrown at me, I've been burned, I've been sexually assaulted in the workplace. Like, there's nothing to gain from coming forward and saying that. Yeah. There's only to lose. And so I think it's important to listen.
What I asked Janelle was, how do you know you're right? And she gave a pretty good answer about
I know, but just even that question.
Yeah.
I think what might be worth touching on is that we are a panel of people who are not currently workers. And I think that is in part because we have the safety of some kind of distance. We can be up here and we don't have to worry about our careers in the way that somebody who is totally subject to, a really tough boss or an abuser. And what really disturbed me when the Barbara Lynch story came out was not what it said, because we already knew about a lot of that. It was the response from readers who said, this is just how restaurants are. If you didn't like it, you could just leave. Like, why would a worker come forward to be told that they deserved it because they were there? Like, how insane is that?
Yeah, talk about that. And Janelle, I wonder if, well, first, no, I want to stay with you, Irene, for just a second. Because I'm wondering if there's a way for, you are a restaurant owner. Is there a way for there to be, some sort of an organization with, maybe there already is, I mean, there's not 9 to 5, but something where there are Boston restaurant owners that stand up and say, we want to provide a place. I'm trying.
This is something I've talked to some peers about, and there are some peers in the audience who I know would be very enthusiastic about trying to do something constructive. I don't know what it is. I don't know if we have to sign a pledge that says, like, if your name appears in a Boston Globe article because you wanted to hold your boss accountable for something, you should still apply to work here, and we're not going to throw your resume out. Like, I don't know if that's what it takes. And in order for us to know, we have to be listening to more workers.
Yeah.
And I guess for the people who I've approached with that, about half of them say, yeah, those are some good ideas. Let me know when you do it.
Yeah.
So
it's still so scary.
Yeah, it's scary. It's about complicity. It is about fear. It's about people who came up under these chefs. And, nobody, I think, this is my opinion, who comes forward like purely hates the person who they are talking about. In many cases, it's super complicated.
Actually,
and so
I want to ask Janelle.
Comes through.
Yeah, I want to ask Janelle about that. There are a lot of people, especially in your investors article today, who were furious at what they saw as Barbara Lynch's behavior, but it's because they cared about her.
Yeah, I think that was true for a lot of the people who were willing to come forward about the story. The investors certainly, because they backed her, because they believed in her when they wanted her to open the restaurants. But even a lot of the employees who got to know her really well, like, they want what's best for her and for the restaurant group. There are 180, 200 people who work there. If she goes under, those people lose their jobs too, right? So they want accountability, and they want some level of acknowledgement that the allegations, are taken seriously. But I think, it's done in terms of the investor piece. It's interesting because I think when we hear the word investor in a context of business, we think, oh, investors, they're the people that hold the business accountable. But it's really different in the restaurant world. And I don't think everyone understands that. But just in talking with restaurant investors, like, a lot of people cut a check and that's it. Mm-hmm. Like, you don't necessarily even get the table you want. And they tell me just how upset they are about that. But like, a lot of times that's where the relationship really stops. And so when I was talking to investors for this story, they said, I haven't seen Barbara in years.
Yeah.
Or I really don't have anything I can do or say to make anything change.
Well, it's interesting because an audience member is asking just that, how can these people, abusers, be held more accountable? Should pressure be put on investors? And we're hearing, Janelle, that maybe that's not the avenue. How about on the James Beard Awards or Michelin? Your thoughts, Cecil?
And beyond the awards system, even hospitality and culinary schools don't properly equip future industry leaders with leadership skills, with workplace mental health education, with de-escalation training, de-escalation skills, or, there's so many complex things that we face. I used to be a restaurateur, I'm not anymore, but when you're in charge of employing, hundreds or dozens or thousands, in some cases, people, a lot of times, to Janelle's point, it's just capital. So technically, even our government doesn't hold us accountable, because technically, if you have the capital, you can employ thousands of people and not have leadership skills and not have any understanding of workplace mental health and not know how to prevent workplace trauma, not even understand what goes into making a toxic work environment. And so that's really complex too, right? There's so many different players that are upholding, and I really want to count myself in that. Like, I don't think of myself as innocent. I think we're all complicit in upholding these systems.
Well, because we go. We go to the restaurant sometimes, even though we know. And Hannah, I want to go to you next, especially because you've got David Chang in your experience. I once was a little more, on the ground with the restaurant industry than I certainly am now. I used to host a show on the Food Network called Ready, Set, Cook. Of all these, it was just a crazy food game show, but I loved it because every night we had James Beard Award winners who would then take ingredients and make something. And after we taped the 5 shows, we'd all go out. So I'd have Michel Richard and Jean-Louis Paladin. I know, not bad, but by the 5th taping, they were both completely drunk and speaking in French. I mean, there was just this sense of, this kind of body life that they were all, and this was not in the 90s. This was before this kind of image of a outsized chef had been blown up. But it wasn't everyone. I remember Patrick O'Connell, who was the chef at the Inn at Little Washington, perhaps the sweetest man. I would get to go into all these kitchens, and most of them were throwing pots and stuff. It was scary. But he was very quiet, and I remember standing one day at a cooktop, and there was a sous chef there, and the fellow's sleeve caught on fire. And Patrick said, "I believe you're on fire." And he said, "Chef, I believe you're right." And I mean, it was just this refined, quiet, and he was known for that because it was so unusual. I guess my open question here, how did this happen? That it became an industry where it was not just allowed, but it was celebrated that you would throw things and that, people could catch on fire and you wouldn't care. And anybody?
I have sort of an answer to that. I mean, and I went to culinary school, not to get too granular, but there is a system in culinary schools called the Brigade system, which comes from a French chef called Escoffier. And that system establishes a hierarchy among chefs within the kitchen. And that system essentially says there's a guy at the top, be that the executive chef or the chef de cuisine, and there's a guy at the bottom. It could be the entremetier or the garde-manger who runs the cold station. And then there's all the guys in between who run the grill station, saucier. There's the patissier who runs the pastry station. And the system is set up to have a person over another person, over another person, over another person. And all of those people yell at the people in between. That is how the Brigade system works. And that is how every culinary student in the United States and in plenty of other countries, the Cordon Bleu operates this way, train their culinary stages. And that is what you learn when you come into culinary school, and that is what you learn when you come into an American or European style restaurant. And so the first thing you learn when you come into dining is there is someone above me, there is someone below me. It is okay to be yelled at. It is okay to be reprimanded. Yes, chef. Yes, chef. Yes, chef. And that is drilled into you from the very beginning.
And then someday maybe you'll get to kick someone else.
Absolutely.
I just want to hold on one second because we have some sound, Irene, that you were involved in. Now, many people know that Irene has done some of our city spaces, and it's fabulous. And you had a visit with Ming Tsai. I think you were the bus driver, and you took him to school that day. Yes. This was in February, and the conversation made a lot of news because Ming Tsai joked with you, first of all, about roofing your drink. Ha, ha, ha. So funny, drugging a woman's drink. But I think what we have is his reaction to your question about Me Too. I think that's what we have. Let's listen.
Tiffany Faison was here a couple weeks ago talking about abuse and some of the issues that you've mentioned. Do you think that Boston will have a Me Too moment in the restaurant industry?
Have we not? Have we not been talking about it enough? I mean, you mean specific?
We had Batali's case here, but he's, we don't claim him. I mean, no one does, but.
Yeah. I mean, are you saying there's going to be another gigantic fiascos?
Yeah, or even anyone held accountable for, anything.
Well, I burnt a Bing earlier. I hope that's okay. Yeah, I mean, I hope every day, right? I mean,
yeah.
I hope, I think I can proudly say all my chef buddies around the country, I was just on the phone with Daniel Boulud and Thomas Keller, we were in Lyon. None of us are like that, right? So it's like social media. The bad boys get the press, right? So it's not the whole industry is a bunch of SOBs. It's not.
Irene, I just want I can see your face. I see your face now. Your reaction to that?
Well, what I'm reflecting on as we're talking is that, sure, we have an abusive kind of culture that comes from yelling and hierarchy, but also, you don't have to be someone who yells to be someone who abuses people in your business. You can look outwardly like a good guy in Lyon and still have done horrible things to people. And so I don't want to, pull those two things apart too much because I think they're comorbid conditions, but I do want to just kind of remind us that outwardly abusive is not a requirement for privately abusive. Yeah. And I think that we are going to keep learning that and keep hearing about it. And I think that, Ming didn't want to answer the question. So he didn't. And that was an answer in itself, in my opinion.
Yeah, I saw you shaking your head, Hannah.
I find that entire answer infuriating. I mean, I can't think of one major culinary figure who has fallen from grace, who has suffered true accountability. I mean, and Mario Batali is probably one of the worst offenders, right? We know of true horrific sexual allegations against him in Ken Friedman's restaurant on the 3rd floor, the so-called rape room. I mean, literally referred to as the rape room. And he's acquitted of all charges in this fine city and will be opening another restaurant soon. I mean, what accountability? What accountability? Every single day we're holding each other accountable. In what way?
So, Hassel, I guess as an advocacy group, you've made some suggestions, but you've also told WBUR this morning that there are dark and painful conversations we have to have, but if we don't have those conversations, and you understand why we're not having those conversations, because it's frightening for people to have those conversations, but it's a vicious loop, because if we don't have them, then nothing's going to change. So again, I guess the same question I was asking Irene, what are some of the ways this can change?
I think we need to be investing in adequate education, training, skill building from the get-go, from culinary hospitality schools. In every restaurant, there should be regulated trainings that are enforced. When food and safety, we have inspectors and we have trainings that are legally government mandated to do. There's nothing like that for labor practices. There's nothing like that for leadership. There's nothing like that for worker rights.
When you think about it, inspectors, but nobody's
there's no labor inspectors.
Where's the serve safe for just safety?
So, not to just plug myself, but we did create, so Not 9 to 5 did create a certification called Connected, which is to build workplace mental health education and build on leadership skills around these topics. I think also we need to recognize that, conversations need to happen regularly. I'm really grateful to this panelists and this event and for hosting, because this conversation doesn't get enough airtime because it's uncomfortable and it's scary and it's hard and it's deep and it's intense and it's complex and it's nuanced. And I think that it's really important to keep the conversation going and to open up conversations for others to be more involved as well, because really, a lot of these conversations are not just helping to understand the abuse, understand the trauma, understand how to prevent it, but it's also suicide prevention. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of suicide that happens around these topics. A lot of people don't get the help they need. They don't get the access to resources and supports that they need. And beyond therapy, far beyond that, there's a lot of prevention that we can do. So I think my answer to that would be prevention. I think we need to take a proactive approach to this topic instead of just always reacting post-crisis, post-death, incidents and reports and articles like these.
Janelle, in your reporting, there were 2 deaths in Barbara Lynch's restaurant that were drug-related. But I know you want to weigh in. Can you add this to what you want to say? Is there any legislation? Is there something more that can be done on the legal level?
We have to look at the fact that we are not paying people living wages. And under like the way in which people feel like they are under threat is because they are being underpaid, right? I talk to a lot of restaurant owners who are trying to struggle to meet the new, wage requirements in Massachusetts, and we keep raising the wage to try and get to a place where people can live, right? But these are all elements that contribute to this, because when people feel vulnerable financially, they can't leave a job, and they might stay in a position where they're being taken advantage of or abused or facing other things. So it all ties together, right? We need to figure out a way to undo. The tip structure is a big problem too. You've got people who, earn tips based on, how much people like the way they look, right? You've got a lot of factors built into the way people are paid and work in restaurants that are just, the system doesn't, it's not like anything else. And so a lot of places are trying to rethink that, which I think is another part of the puzzle too.
I'm just going to jump in to say that today, we know that some of Barbara Lynch's workers had sued, saying that she didn't fairly give them their tips. And today, Lynch's lawyers respond to that by saying that they did, that they gave them 100%. So that's an ongoing question. But jump in with anything you wanted. But but also just somewhere in here, what about unions?
I think wage theft happens, but I also think, going back to the topic of the Brigade system, stages still happen. That's just another form of wage theft.
What's a stage, Hassel?
So, asking people to work and be exploited for free and not be paid for many hours, weeks, months, sometimes years of labor. It goes unpaid. And again, there's so many Michelin-rated, award-winning, Jay's Beard-winning restaurants that are still doing this and using this oppressive practice to exploit workers.
Okay,
and I think that really needs to be understood.
A stage. Please take it, Hannah.
STAGE. It's in French, stage. It's essentially an unpaid internship for culinary students or recent graduates of culinary school who come and work at a fine dining establishment, usually for a 3-month period of time.
But sometimes longer.
Sometimes longer.
And so I think these systems, the Brigade system, the tipping system.
What's the Brigade system? I'm sorry.
She called it Brigade. Brigade, Cuisine de Brigade. It's French. Escoffier created it. This was created in the name of efficiency. It's actually not efficient at all, and it's not effective. It doesn't create. It creates so much destruction and harm within a business for people, but the alternative, so the antidote, is psychological safety. What we need to learn more about is not just what isn't working, but what can work. We've looked at so many other industries outside of ours, and we realize we don't have to create the wheel. There's psychological safety in other work environments. There's a return on investment. When you invest in people, there's a return on investment to the business. And so if anyone's listening and is like, what is psychological safety? It means that you have an environment in the workplace. If you're talking about the workplace, psychological safety means that people feel safe enough to take risks, make mistakes, give and receive feedback, be vulnerable with one another without any fear of negative consequence to the job itself or to how they're perceived by their peers. And so if you don't have that, if you can't make a mistake, if you can't give and receive feedback with each other, then you're missing psychological safety.
Yeah.
And the Brigade system is not providing psychological safety, because it means that input only comes downwards. It doesn't go upwards. Again, that means you're not giving and receiving feedback.
There's a description of abuse. Dad kicks mom, mom kicks the kid kicks the dog. And it just trickles down that chain. Irene, just can you let us know, how does this feel? You've given us a really good sense, but especially with the Barbara Lynch story, we know that's not the only story, but it's the most recent and pretty explosive. What's going on? Are you all talking about this all the time? Are you feeling unsettled? What's your sense of things?
Yeah, the group chats are very active, Robin. I think what I'm really interested in is how we get workers the resources they need, prevention related and also response. I think I said when I was on the Common with Daryl C. Murphy, I never thought this was going to happen. Because
what the accusations
that anyone would write an article about anyone. Like, I just thought it was never going to happen. And I had kind of resigned myself to, well, I guess I work in an industry where there's no accountability, which is a terrible feeling. That's how it feels. But how do we get workers the resources they need if they want to tell their story? Workers don't and maybe shouldn't trust journalists if they're not media trained, if they do not understand journalistic standards. Like, that is a very scary place to be. And I know lots of workers, and I have personally supported workers who are talking to journalists and their story goes nowhere. And I'm not saying that that's anyone's fault, but like, journalistic standards are not the same as, I think, like, decent human decency standards. And so if you're someone who's made a report, who's talked to a journalist, and maybe even a part of your story was published and you got nothing out of it, like, why would you report? And so I think that all of this comes back to education, educating ourselves in our industry, educating our guests that, like, yeah, this stuff actually does happen. It's not just stuff we see on TV. These things do happen, and I don't know. I hope that we can make progress on that. But I also think, workers need an intermediary to support them to tell their stories in many cases, and I would like to see more of that.
Well, a couple things. And Janelle, I want you to step in here and talk about the journalism of it, but I'm wondering, is there a way to have a collaborative that decides we're going to have a workers' bill of rights, even though I asked about unions. I don't know. I mean, is there a strong union that runs through restaurants? But outside of that, some sort of workers' bill of rights that restaurants can then, like a seal of approval, can say, yeah, we sign on to that. And of course, the restaurant that has the David Chang, they'd laugh at that, right? I mean,
But who's going to hold them accountable when they aren't doing it? I mean, we all say we do things that we don't. And again, it's not always going to be the loudest chef who is doing the dirtiest shit. So I think that's my concern. And just to speak briefly to unions, I mean, obviously unions are extremely powerful, but the time and the money and the energy and the dedication it takes to organize a union in a small independent business where workers are inherently somewhat transient, I don't think that's going to do it for us.
Yeah.
I mean, we could also discuss, not to interrupt you here, but hotel restaurants do typically have unions built in, just as a matter of course, but in Boston recently, the workers at Christina Tosi's Milk Bar attempted to establish a union, and she union busted them. So another Momofuku alumna there. So unions can get busted pretty easily by restaurateurs.
Yeah. Again, Hannah Selinger, who was at Momofuku with David Chang, he of the violent temper, when she was unceremoniously fired. And Irene Lee, again, May Dumplings, Hassel Aviles, not 9 to 5. Janelle Nanos, the Boston Globe. Address some of the things you've been hearing that, you told the story, but what I'm hearing is that most people, many journalists don't tell the story.
So it's a really complicated thing to tell a story like this. And to be honest with you, when I was writing a story about Barbara Lynch in 2018, I was hearing things. And the sort of the open secret that, again, we talked about in the sort of promotion of this event, you need to have a standard by which, as journalistically, you can feel confident that you can come and put out a story, because there are consequences for your publication, right? And so, I mean, a lot of times that needs to be people, like, not maybe more than, needs to sort of show, as I said earlier, like a pattern of abuse. I do think it's hard when you don't necessarily know how to interact with a journalist, or you haven't done this before, to know what to say. And I do think that there would probably be a good place for a local organization who wants to help represent workers navigate that circumstance. Because as a journalist, my inbox floods every day with pitches, right? And I don't know necessarily, like, you know, what's real, how much can that build a story? And so I always kind of have to suss out. And when I get allegations of abuse, I take them very seriously. But it does have to hit a threshold for, you know, editors to say, there's a story there.
You were saying you have to think of the liability for your paper.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking, there was this Paul Newman movie, I can never remember the name of it. It was years ago. And it was a trial, and it had something to do with a woman who did decide to come forward and tell her story to the papers. And I've never forgotten this. This is always in my mind when I ask someone to tell me something. She regretted it. And the shot is, does anybody remember this movie? The shot is she wakes up the next day, and there's kind of mist in her neighborhood. The Verdict, 1982. I just knew that. Somebody told me that. The Verdict, 1982, Paul Newman's movie. And the shot is she's kind of a frail woman, and she comes out the door in the mist of dawn, and she's got her nightgown on, and she tries to take back every paper. Absence of malice. She tries to take back every paper from every porch, and she's disappearing down the street, and you have the enormity of what she's trying, and the impossibility of what she's trying to do. So you have to be conscious of that.
Yeah, and I think there's also a tendency within the industry, I find, that a lot of people would love to talk on background.
On background.
On background, sure. And that's okay for some people, because sometimes there's trauma there. Sometimes, like, it's too much to put your name out there, and I absolutely appreciate that. And I respect that. But there's also lots of people who like to go and mouth off, but they won't put their names to it. And I think that that's another part of the problem sometimes, because again, like, there's a lot of chefs who want to say things, right? And we talk a lot about it,
yeah.
right? But they won't go on the record either, and they know things or they've heard things. And so it's this, we talk around issues a lot. But it's a small industry here, and I think there's a lot of people who fear that blowback and what will happen.
I can tell you it's the same thing. I'm from Toronto in Canada. It's the same thing there. And I've talked to people, Argentina, New Zealand, Copenhagen, globally. Our nonprofit is global. We have global network. And so we get DMs from workers, emails from workers all the time. And it's a different version of the same story absolutely everywhere. And I really, again, not to sound like a broken record, but I really think it's because the foundation of our industry is based on systems of oppression. If you go back to the history of restaurants and hospitality, the Brigade system, tipping, a lot of this comes from times of enslavement. A lot of this is drenched and immersed and marinated deeply in white supremacy culture, misogyny, patriarchy, transphobia, homophobia, like all the different systems of oppression are rampant in the foundation of the history of our industry. And so everything that we add on top of that is built on that foundation. And until we acknowledge that and address that and start to reevaluate all the different systems, whether it's wages, whether it's education, whether it's training, whether it's how we build a restaurant model, it's just going to keep happening, and it is still happening. But I will say, in the same sense of like you saying, Irene, I can't believe these articles are coming out now, and like you didn't think it would happen. I agree with you, and that's how I felt also with the Great Resignation, because I never thought I would see that in my lifetime, seeing workers finally have that much leverage and that much power against employers, and still do, I think, in a way. There's a when I talk to students that are coming up in the industry or people that are entry level, they're way more intolerant of the bullshit that I put up with when I was in restaurants. And that gives me a lot of hope, because I do want to give hope. I don't think it's all doom and gloom. Like, I've seen so much change in the last couple of years since the pandemic. And I think that even this event wouldn't have happened 10 years ago.
Hannah, I know you were trying to jump in. I want to let you do so.
Oh, well, I mean, I think we were talking earlier also about sort of the optimism that we have in terms of, what we see going forward. And I think a lot of it hinges on what you were saying, which is that the emerging generation who goes into restaurants now they don't have the same tolerance for the conditions under which we worked when we came up in restaurants. For those of us who came up in restaurants, when I was working 15-hour days and not seeing my family on holidays and being yelled at by tyrants and, making what I thought was a lot of money, but if you break it down by hours, was really not very much money, and working in at-will conditions and never knowing if I was going to be fired or not. People who are coming up in restaurants, I think, have a much lower threshold for that. And so I think, if there's, in addition to breaking barriers in being whistleblowers and our outcry and all of that, I think that the hope is that the people who go into restaurants now are steeled and say things like, well, this is not a tolerable condition, and people shouldn't have to work, 4 weeks in a row without a vacation day, and it's acceptable to want to see your family at the holidays, and it's acceptable to want medical leave and to want all of the normal benefits, that normal people get in a society, and that's where sort of change and youthful optimism, I think, comes in.
It's funny because somebody asked, what is the generational aspect, and you are explaining what it is. And Irene, I do want to hear from you, but before that, you mentioned talking to Daryl C. Murphy, the beloved Daryl C. Murphy, on BUR's daily news podcast, The Common. And here's another clip of your conversation, about what can be done.
Irene, what would you like to see happen next?
Oh, that's such a tough question, Daryl, because again, it's not up to me to tell anyone else's story. And I think that for us as chefs, the first step is being honest with each other. Mm-hmm. And I think that whispering, we can do better than that. And I would like to hear more chefs being supportive of workers' stories. I would like us to say as an industry that we are not going to blackball or blacklist people who have spoken out. I think there are a lot of next steps we can take, and it really depends where we're really sitting in this power dynamic, in this ecosystem. And so I think we all have our own job to do.
And just again, how might that look? I mean, when you say as chefs, we're not going to blackball someone, is that women standing arm in arm, or women and men standing arm in arm on a platform at the food festival, in the fall? Is it, what is it? How does that happen?
I don't know. There's a lot of ways to signal that you think certain things are important or that you honor certain values, and there's a lot of ways to not actually do it. So I don't know that workers should trust the word of chefs who say, I swear I'm not an abuser. Like what? I don't know how that works. And one of the things that I personally struggle with is this generational shift. And I'm about as progressive as they come. And I do have days where team members will ask me for things, and I just have to breathe a deep sigh, because do they deserve what they're asking for? Absolutely. Should every worker have access to that thing they want? Like, yeah, probably. And it's so hard. And we're trying, and we're not there yet. And even peers who I think are incredibly progressive are like taking to Facebook to say like, the kids are soft. And like, maybe they are. Maybe they should be. Maybe people should be soft in restaurants. Maybe that's okay. And so, of course, you can't boil it down to just that. There's a big spectrum, but we are in what Hassel calls the messy middle. There's a lot of static because of this shift. And so, I welcome the criticism and the feedback and the love from my team. And I see that it's hard.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm hoping we can talk about is like, how many people do you need on the record to break a big story? Does anyone here know? I'm just not sure. Shouldn't we all know? And I know there's not a calculus to it per se.
There's not a calculus to it, certainly. I mean,
it could be one.
It could be one. It could be one. I know, Robin, we often talk about the rule of threes. So, like you sort of feel like 3 is a trend. 3 is, three comes up a lot when we're building narratives. That's by no means like the calculus. But I mean, I just think, unfortunately, it's always more is better in these instances. And you don't want there to be more, right? You don't want there to have been years and decades of abuse that went unnoticed. But, when you can get that critical mass, it does create that sort of pattern that I talked about. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's like cool to hear because I think workers don't know that. And like people who are not journalists don't know that there is a way to ensure that you have a story told, or that you bring enough to the table. Like restaurant workers are really good at like performing to spec. And so if you say, I need 3 people on the record, like we can do it. We can set that up. And like, I don't know if you, Janelle, have ever said like, I've got 1 person on the record and I need 2 more. And are you willing? And I don't know if like getting workers around a table so that they can be like, I'll fucking do it if you do it. Like, I don't know. Like, when are we going to start doing that?
And what I'm hearing from you, Irene, is this rage that this was out there for so long and so many people knew about it and so many people started to do reporting on it and it didn't happen. Look, this has been so invigorating. We knew it was going to be I hear you. I don't think we're hearing half of what you'd like to say. But what can we do? Like, I wish, we know when there's a local restaurant, it's got a little medallion. How do we know, as restaurant goers, how do we know where to go? How do, if everybody in the city knew about this, well, I can see people saying, but I didn't know, so how do I choose the restaurant to go to?
That's such a tricky question. I think also in thinking of workers going to media, I think we also need to be careful with that. Because like I said earlier, food media is complicit in upholding those that are causing harm and abuse and other kinds of, trauma. So I think we have to be careful. I think also just encouraging workers to go to the same media that's upholding, right? Like not all reporters are going to take these allegations, these stories seriously. Because I've had so many times where, like you said, they go unwritten about. I think it's hard because also food media is also complicit in keeping consumers blind and unknowing of the realities that happen behind closed doors of restaurants. There's not a lot of stories that report on the realities. There's way more that report food critics and, restaurant reviews and the awards and all these different things. There's way more. If you look at stories written, there's way less stories written on these
There's
these
a lot
topics.
invested in that, in all sorts of media. And we all have an investment in keeping our restaurants a place that we go to forget about our problems, right? It's a fairy tale.
Exactly.
And it looks better at night than it does during the day, with little lights and everything. So we're all complicit. But
Exactly.
if we want to make better decisions as consumers, how do we do it?
I would say ask workers.
Ask
Again, like I
workers.
said earlier, listen to workers, ask them directly.
I mean, you can also Google. I mean, I know that sounds very basic, but there are things on the internet. I can't tell you how many public relations emails I get promoting things about David Chang, which should never hit my inbox. So, there are articles existing about not just David Chang, plenty of people, obviously Barbara Lynch, don't support these people. Don't support people who have existing allegations against them. I'm not calling for like a worldwide boycott of every single restaurant in the world. That would be ridiculous.
Or a Yelp for complaints. Oh, there is one.
But a sort of cursory amount of research.
You can find it.
You can find things on the internet. It's worthwhile to look into that stuff before you.
I think our communities are small too, right? Like we all know. If you ask hospitality community,
Yeah, like
We all know.
Ask other chefs.
no, seriously.
Tiffany Faison knows. I know. So I think ask other chefs. And also, I like to ask workers, where's the best place you ever worked? Because I don't think it is necessarily fair to ask workers to share what's happened to them or might be currently happening to them so that we can feel better as consumers. But I do think that that's another way to frame the question and to, again, like uplift workers and owners who are really trying. And
Where's the best place you worked? And if it's not where they're standing serving you, that's a big clue. Yeah?
I mean, I wouldn't ask in the dining room, but other than here, where's the best place you ever worked? I don't know. I think that we could just do a much better job listening to each other and not just to food media, and we can do our own research. Chef name, theft, abuse, controversy, Google, like there it is.
Yeah.
And if it's the chef who started the controversy for a good reason, then you know that too.
What a great conversation. I think it's only just the beginning, you know, I hope, of many conversations like this. I smell book. Janelle, I'm looking at you, but I just want to thank you all, Janelle, Irene, Hannah, Hassel, and everybody here and everybody leaning forward, I'm sure, wanting to have their voices heard through you. So thank you.
And thank you to all the workers who came tonight.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you to our virtual audiences. Thank you again to our panelists, Janelle, Hannah, Irene Hassel, and our moderator, Robin Young. Coming up at CitySpace, join us for our next curated cuisine. We'll be talking about food waste with Irene, and some amazing ideas to think differently about what's in your fridge with Irene and her sister Margaret, who just published their book, Perfectly Good Food. That's at wbur.org/events for more. Thank you all.
Sorry about my job, Irene. Thank you all.
Thank you.
you.